It was a Friday unlike any other that the ancient city of Jerusalem had ever witnessed. Heavy, suffocating clouds gathered above the hill known as Golgotha, hovering like a silent judgment waiting to fall. The air was thick with tension, a palpable weight that pressed down on the chests of everyone present, from the high priests in their temple to the common beggars in the streets. At the foot of the hill, where the rocky ground prepared to receive the blood of the condemned, a Roman centurion stood like a statue carved from iron and discipline. His name was Longinus, and on this day he was carrying out orders that would eventually split the timeline of human history in two. Longinus was not a man prone to emotion or hesitation. As a centurion, he was a commander of a legion, responsible for over 100 soldiers. He was an officer greatly admired by his superiors for his unyielding discipline, his courage in the face of death, and his brutal effectiveness on the battlefield. His entire existence had revolved around toughness, violence, and duty. To rise to the rank of centurion within the Roman Empire, strength alone was never enough. One had to be intelligent, strategic, and above all, ruthless. Longinus possessed all these qualities in abundance. His life was defined by order and blind obedience to Rome. He had witnessed death thousands of times without flinching. He had executed orders that would break lesser men without a moment of hesitation. He had become a perfect instrument of the empire, a weapon of war sheathed in human flesh. Your support gives voice to the witnesses of history and strength to stories that must be heard. Hit like and subscribe to help us tell what the empire tried to silence. Stay with us, because you simply will not believe how this executioner's journey ends. However, as he stood there waiting for the prisoner, something felt different. The man they were preparing to execute was Jesus of Nazareth. The orders were clear and simple: make sure Jesus died. It was a task Longinus had performed countless times, yet the atmosphere today was charged with a strange, ominous energy. The sky itself seemed to be reacting to the events unfolding below. Tradition and history would later record that darkness covered all the land from the 6th hour until the 9th hour, a supernatural gloom that turned day into night. But before that darkness fully descended, Longinus stood his ground, his face carved by years of violence, his arms crossed over his chest. He watched the preparations with a hawk-like gaze, ensuring his soldiers maintained the perimeter. He did not know it yet, but the armor he wore, the authority he wielded, and the empire he served were all about to be challenged by the death of a single, unarmed man. The events leading to this dark Friday had begun before the city had fully awakened. While most of Jerusalem slept, hurried footsteps echoed through the narrow stone streets, and hushed voices whispered a name that spread through the shadows like wildfire: Jesus of Nazareth. The night before, under the cover of darkness, he had been arrested in the quiet solitude of the Garden of Gethsemane. The betrayal had come from within his own circle, a kiss from one of his own disciples, Judas Iscariot, who had sold his master out for 30 pieces of silver. It was a transaction of blood that would stain history forever. Jesus was taken swiftly before the Sanhedrin, the powerful council of chief priests and elders. The trial was a mockery of justice, filled with anger and fear. They accused him of blasphemy, of declaring himself the Son of God, a crime punishable by death under their law. In that hall, they beat him, spat on him, and condemned him with venomous hatred. Yet, despite their fury, the religious leaders lacked the legal power to carry out a capital execution. For that, they needed the iron fist of Rome. They needed the approval of the governor. And so, as the first light of dawn struggled to break through the gray morning, they dragged the prisoner before Pontius Pilate, the Roman governor of Judea. Pilate, sitting at his judgment seat, looked at the man before him with a mixture of curiosity and skepticism. This prisoner did not look like a revolutionary or a criminal. Pilate asked him directly, asking, "Are you the king of the Jews?" Jesus, standing bruised and bound, answered calmly, "You have said so." The chief priests and elders erupted in a cacophony of accusations, hurling insults and charges at the prisoner, desperate to secure a death sentence. But amidst the chaos, Jesus remained silent. He stood with a dignity that seemed to unnerve the governor. Pilate, perplexed by this refusal to fight back, leaned toward him and asked, "Do you not hear everything they are accusing you of? Are you not going to defend yourself?" Jesus said nothing, not a single word. He neither justified his actions nor defended his innocence. Pilate was astonished. In his years as governor, he had seen hardened criminals beg, lie, and weep to save their lives. He had seen strong men crumble in the face of Roman justice. But this man possessed an overwhelming calmness that defied logic. It was a silence that spoke louder than the shouting crowd outside. Just as Pilate wrestled with his decision, a messenger hurriedly approached the tribunal, breathless and anxious. He brought an urgent message from Pilate's wife. The note was a desperate warning. "Have nothing to do with this innocent man, for I have suffered greatly today in a dream because of him." Pilate shifted restlessly in his seat. He sensed that something far greater than political unrest was unfolding before him. He felt powerless to stop the momentum of the hatred directed at this man. Looking for a way out, he remembered the custom of the Passover festival, where the governor would release one prisoner chosen by the people. Pilate saw this as his chance to escape this dilemma. He presented the crowd with a choice: Jesus, the man who preached peace, or Barabbas, a notorious criminal and a known murderer. Pilate stood before the gathering storm of people and asked, "Which one do you want me to release to you? Barabbas, or Jesus, who is called Christ?" The priests and religious leaders moved through the crowd like snakes, stirring up anger, whispering lies, and inciting the mob to demand blood. When Pilate asked for their decision, the crowd shouted in unison, "Release Barabbas!" Pilate, shocked by their choice, raised his hands and asked, "Then what shall I do with Jesus?" The response was a roar of fury that shook the pillars of the judgment hall. "Crucify him." Uneasy, and seeing his authority slipping away, Pilate asked once more, "Why? What evil has he done?" But logic had no place here. The mob was consumed by a blind rage. Their response was fiercer and louder than before, a chant that demanded death. "Crucify him! Crucify him!" Pilate saw clearly that he stood powerless before the rising tide of fury. A riot was beginning, and Rome would not tolerate disorder. He made his choice, sacrificing justice for order. He called for a basin filled with water and washed his hands in front of the entire crowd, a symbolic gesture of futility. He declared loudly, "I am innocent of this righteous man's blood. His fate rests with you." Then Pilate ordered Barabbas to be freed. He handed Jesus over to the soldiers to be flogged and crucified. The fate of the Son of God was sealed by the roar of a crowd and the weakness of a governor, setting the stage for the tragedy that Longinus would oversee on the Hill of Skulls. The verdict had been delivered, and the machinery of the Roman Empire began to turn with cold efficiency. The soldiers seized Jesus, dragging him roughly from the judgment seat into the inner courtyard of the governor's headquarters, known as the Praetorium. The centurion Longinus took his position at the entrance, his boots planting firmly on the stone floor, his posture rigid and commanding. He had overseen dozens of punishments just like this one. He had watched many men break before they even reached the cross. But on this day, as the soldiers prepared their grim work, something felt distinctly different to the seasoned commander. The prisoner before them offered absolutely no resistance. He did not scream for mercy. He did not curse the soldiers or their mothers. He did not beg for his life. He simply stood there, enduring the rough handling as if he knew it was a necessary part of a larger design. The soldiers, a whole company of them gathered together, found cruel amusement in the situation. To them, this was not a holy man. He was just another conquered subject, a distraction from their boredom. They stripped him of his outer garments, exposing his back to the cold air and the coming violence. They bound his hands tightly to a stone pillar, the rough rope digging into his wrists. The flogging began without ceremony. The whip, weighted with pieces of bone and metal, fell again and again. It was a brutal rhythm, the sound of leather striking flesh echoing off the stone walls. Longinus watched with his arms crossed, his face an unreadable mask carved by years of violence. He expected the prisoner to cry out, to plead, to shatter under the agony. Yet, even as the stripes appeared on his back, Jesus did not cry out. He gasped for air, his body seizing with every blow, but his silence remained unbroken. Longinus shifted his weight, his eyes narrowing. He had seen the bravest warriors of Gaul and Germania scream under the lash. This silence was unnatural. It was unnerving. The other soldiers, emboldened by the prisoner's lack of defense, escalated their mockery. They wanted to break his spirit since they could not break his silence. They found a purple robe, the color of royalty, and threw it draped around his bleeding shoulders. One of them, laughing at his own dark creativity, twisted together a branch of sharp thorns into a crude circle. With a cruel shove, he drove this crown of thorns onto Jesus' head. Blood began to stream down his face, staining the dust on his skin, yet his eyes remained open. They were steady, they were calm. They placed a fragile reed stick in his right hand as if it were a royal scepter. Then, the soldiers knelt before him in mock homage, laughing and shouting, "Hail, King of the Jews!" They spat on him. They took the reed from his hand and struck him repeatedly on the head, driving the thorns deeper. Longinus did not join in their laughter. He stood apart, watching the spectacle with a growing sense of unease. For the first time in years, he felt a disturbance in his conscience, not because of the violence was his trade, but because of the dignity of the man being beaten. When the soldiers finally tired of their cruel game, they tore off the purple robe and dressed him again in his own clothes to prepare him for crucifixion. Longinus could not look away from Jesus. He could not understand why, in the midst of such profound humiliation, there was no hatred in the prisoner's eyes. There was only a profound, sorrowful compassion. While his men laughed, Longinus began to silently question who this man truly was. The order was given to move out. The soldiers took hold of Jesus, pushing him out of the praetorium and back into the public eye. They brought forward a rough, heavy wooden cross, timber that was already stained by the histories of other condemned men who had walked this path before. They shoved the heavy beam onto Jesus' wounded shoulders. The path toward Golgotha had officially begun. Longinus marched at the very front of the procession. It was his duty to clear the way through the chaotic streets of Jerusalem. He barked orders, his voice cutting through the noise of the crowd, forcing people to step back against the walls. The air was filled with a cacophony of sound. Some people shouted in anger, caught up in the mob mentality, hurling insults and spitting at the condemned man. Others, however, stood in stunned silence or wept openly. Jesus moved forward with agonizing slowness. The weight of the wood pressed down on his fresh wounds, grinding against bone and torn muscle. He took one step, then another, his breath coming in ragged gasps. Longinus looked back over his shoulder, checking the pace. He needed to keep the procession moving. Rome did not like delays. Suddenly, a soldier near the rear shoved Jesus violently to keep him moving. The weakened body of the prisoner could not compensate for the force. Jesus collapsed, his knees hitting the hard stones of the street with a sickening thud. The heavy cross crashed down on top of him, pinning him to the ground. It was the first time he fell. The crowd gasped. The soldiers immediately descended on him, yelling fiercely, "Get up, move!" They kicked at the dirt near his face, threatening him with their spears. With a painful, trembling effort, Jesus placed his hands on the stones and slowly pushed himself up. He did not lash out. He did not refuse to rise. He simply stood up, accepted the weight of the cross once more, and continued to walk. Longinus watched this struggle closely. He had seen men defeated by pain, men who refused to walk another step and had to be dragged to their execution. But Jesus was not defeated. There was a resilience within him that physical pain could not touch. The procession moved deeper into the city, the streets narrowing, the heat of the day beginning to rise. Among the crowd, faces blurred together, but the intensity of the moment sharpened Longinus's senses. He saw women clutching their chests in grief. He saw the religious leaders watching with satisfied smirks, and in the center of it all was the man from Nazareth, walking a lonely road of death, while the city he came to save watched him bleed. Longinus kept his hand on the hilt of his sword, his eyes darting between the crowd and the prisoner, ensuring that nothing interrupted the sentence of the empire. He was the guardian of this death march, yet with every step, he felt less like a conqueror and more like a witness to something he could not name. The journey to the Hill of Skulls was long, and the strength of the prisoner was fading fast. Longinus knew that they would not make it to the top if something did not change, but for now, he simply commanded the column forward, one heavy step at a time. The procession moved forward like a slow, wounded beast, struggling against the tide of humanity that clogged the narrow streets of Jerusalem. The noise was deafening, a mixture of jeers, wailing, and the harsh bark of Roman commands. In the midst of this chaotic sea, two figures fought desperately to reach the center of the storm. Mary, the mother of the condemned man, and John, the youngest disciple, pushed against the wall of bodies. Mary sought her son with frantic, tear-filled eyes, but the soldiers and the mob formed an impenetrable barrier. She grabbed John's arm, her voice barely audible over the din, pleading with him to help her get closer, to let her see him one last time before the end. Together, they wedged themselves through a small gap in the crowd. Just as they broke through to the front line, the procession came to a sudden, violent halt. A soldier, frustrated by the slow pace, shoved Jesus forward with unnecessary force. The exhausted prisoner, whose legs were already trembling from the loss of blood and the crushing weight of the wood, could not find his footing. His body collapsed onto the unforgiving stones of the street. It was the second time he fell. The sound of the heavy beam hitting the ground echoed, momentarily silencing those nearby. Mary could no longer hold back. Disregarding the spears of the guards and the danger of the Roman swords, she rushed into the open space. She dropped to her knees beside him, her hands hovering over his battered form, trembling with a mother's helpless grief. She did not scream. The pain was too deep for that. She simply whispered in a broken voice, "I am here." Longinus stepped forward to intervene, his hand moving to his weapon to drive the woman back, but he stopped. He saw Jesus slowly lift his bloodied face. The prisoner did not look at the soldiers or the angry mob. He looked only at his mother. In that brief moment, the chaos of the execution seemed to vanish for them. Jesus, gathering breath that came in painful gasps, spoke softly to her. He did not ask for water or pity. He replied, "You see, Mother, I make all things new." It was a baffling statement to the ears of the centurion. Longinus stood frozen, his arm suspended halfway to his sword. He had expected a final goodbye, a cry of despair, or a plea for a mother's comfort. Instead, the man spoke like a king discussing a great victory, treating his agony as if it were a necessary step in some grand, invisible plan. The soldiers began to shout, raising their whips to force the prisoner up, breaking the moment. Mary was gently but firmly pulled back by John, her eyes locked on her son as he struggled to rise again. Longinus watched the interaction closely, his mind racing. He had seen many mothers weep for their sons on the way to the cross, but he had never seen a son comfort his mother with a prophecy while death waited for him just up the hill. The heavy cross pressed mercilessly into the wounded back of the prisoner, and his body was beginning to fail completely. Jesus took a few more steps, but his knees buckled. He fell again, and this time, despite the threats and the shouts of the soldiers, he could not rise. The strength had left his muscles. He lay in the dust, gasping, his heart beating a frantic rhythm against his ribs. Longinus assessed the situation with the cold pragmatism of a commander. He saw the gray pallor of the prisoner's skin and the way his limbs refused to respond. He knew that if they continued like this, Jesus would die on the street before they ever reached Golgotha. That would be a failure of his orders. The execution had to happen on the cross, not on the cobblestones. He needed a solution, and he needed it immediately. His sharp eyes scanned the crowd, looking for someone strong enough to take the burden. He spotted a man passing by, a sturdy figure coming in from the countryside, clearly not part of the mob. The man looked strong, with broad shoulders capable of bearing the weight. Longinus pointed a gloved finger at him and barked a command that allowed no refusal. "You there, pick up that cross." The man, whose name was Simon of Cyrene, hesitated, looking at the bloody beam and the Roman soldiers. But one look at the spear in Longinus's hand told him that resistance was not an option. He stepped forward, and the soldiers lifted the heavy wood from Jesus' back and placed it onto Simon's shoulders. Slowly, relieved of the crushing weight, Jesus raised himself. His eyes sought those of the stranger. Though he was exhausted and in agony, Jesus gave Simon a glance filled with profound gratitude. It was a silent exchange, a connection between two strangers bound by a moment of suffering. The procession resumed, moving slightly faster now that Simon carried the load. As they neared the city gates, a group of women from Jerusalem stood weeping and wailing, mourning the fate of the teacher they had admired. They beat their chests and tore their clothes in traditional displays of grief. Jesus, hearing their cries, stopped and turned his face toward them. He did not look like a victim seeking pity. Despite his condition, he spoke with the authority of a judge. "Daughters of Jerusalem," he said, his voice raspy but clear, "do not weep for me. Weep instead for yourselves and for your children." Longinus heard those words and felt a chill run down his spine. Once again, something shook deep within him. Who was this man? A man on the brink of a humiliating death should be consumed by his own fear. Yet here he was, warning the living about the future, concerned for the fate of the city that was killing him. The centurion urged the group forward, eager to finish this task, yet the words lingered in his mind. The march continued out of the city gates, leaving the comfort of civilization behind, ascending the dry, dusty path toward the place of the skull, where the final act of this tragedy waited to be written. The march finally came to its end at the place called Golgotha. It was a barren rise of ground, terrifying not for its height but for its purpose. The soldiers, breathing heavily from the exertion of the climb, immediately set about their grim work. The atmosphere shifted from the chaotic noise of the procession to a focused, deadly efficiency. Longinus stood at the perimeter, his eyes scanning the crowd to ensure no one attempted a rescue or a riot, though the exhaustion of the prisoner made the idea of escape impossible. 3 wooden crosses lay waiting on the ground, ominous and heavy. The soldiers grabbed the 2 criminals who had been brought up with Jesus. These men, realizing their final moment had arrived, began to fight with the ferocity of trapped animals. They kicked at the guards, screamed curses at the sky, and begged for mercy that would not come. It took several soldiers to hold them down, pinning their thrashing limbs against the wood before the hammers could do their work. The air was filled with the sounds of struggle and panic. Then the soldiers turned to Jesus. Longinus watched, expecting the same desperate resistance. He braced himself for the struggle, signaling his men to be ready to use force, but the struggle never came. Jesus did not kick. He did not curse the empire or the soldiers. He did not thrash against his captors. He simply stood there, waiting. When the soldiers took hold of his arms, he allowed himself to be led to the center cross. He lay down upon the rough timber as though he were laying down to rest, extending his arms willingly, as if surrendering himself freely to the will of something far greater than Rome. The soldier holding the heavy iron hammer hesitated for a brief second. He looked down at the man beneath him, confused by the lack of fear in his eyes. Usually, the condemned would be screaming by now, their eyes wild with terror, but Jesus looked up at the sky, his lips moving in silent prayer. The soldier shook off his hesitation, for orders were orders, and the work had to be done. One soldier pressed his knee against Jesus' arm to keep it steady. Another raised the hammer. The first blow struck metal, driving the iron spike through flesh and into the wood. A sharp, agonized cry sank into the heavens, not of anger, but of pure physical shock. At the edge of the circle, Mary shuddered as if the blow had struck her own body. John turned his face away, unable to watch, but unable to leave. The crowd murmured at every blow of the hammer, a low wave of sound that rippled through the onlookers. Some wept openly, covering their mouths with their hands, while others continued their mockery, jeering at the man who was being fastened to the wood. Longinus stood motionless, his face like stone, but his mind was racing. He had overseen this procedure so many times that he could predict every sound and movement. Yet, the silence of the victim between the blows was deafening. There was no begging. There were no promises of money or threats of divine retribution. There was only submission to the agony. When the 3 men were finally secured to the beams, the most difficult part of the task began. The soldiers gathered around the crosses to hoist them upright. With grunts of effort and straining muscles, they lifted the cross of Jesus. The wood swayed dangerously in the air for a moment before they guided the base toward the deep hole dug into the rock. With a heavy, sickening thud, the wooden post sank into its socket. The impact shuddered through the entire structure. Jesus' body, now suspended by the nails, shook violently from the sudden stop. The weight of his body pulled against the wounds, locking him into a position of permanent torture. The 2 criminals crucified on either side of him screamed out in fresh pain as their crosses were dropped into place. The scene was a tableau of suffering. The soldiers dusted off their hands, their job mostly done, and stepped back to gamble for the clothes of the victims, casting lots for the seamless tunic Jesus had worn. Below the crosses, the religious leaders and chief priests walked back and forth, looking up with satisfaction. They did not see a tragedy, they seen a victory. They shouted up at the suffering man, their voices dripping with sarcasm. "He saved others," one priest shouted to the crowd, laughing, "but he cannot save himself." Another elder yelled, "If you are the king of Israel, come down from the cross now, and we will believe in you." The crowd laughed, feeding off the energy of the leaders. They taunted him, challenging his power, challenging his identity. Longinus observed the priests with a cold detachment. He saw the hate in their faces, a sharp contrast to the man hanging above them. Jesus looked down at the men mocking him, at the soldiers gambling for his clothes, and at the crowd that had demanded his death. He did not answer their taunts. He breathed in short, painful gasps, fighting for every lungful of air, suspended between the earth that had rejected him and the sky that remained silent. The execution was complete, but the event that would change Longinus forever was only just beginning. The sun beat down relentlessly on the three figures suspended above the rocky ground, but the true heat came from the anger and desperation radiating from the crosses. As the initial shock of the crucifixion began to fade, it was replaced by a dull, throbbing agony that would not cease. The bodies of the men fought a losing battle against gravity, every breath requiring a torturous push against the nails in their feet. Longinus remained at his post, his helmet gleaming in the harsh light, his eyes fixed not just on the crowd, but on the three men dying under his watch. He expected silence, or perhaps the incoherent screaming of men losing their minds, but instead, he became the witness to a conversation that defied all logic. The criminal hanging on the left side of Jesus was consumed by a blind, furious panic. He twisted against the wood, his face contorted with malice. He looked at the religious leaders mocking Jesus below, and he decided to join them. He turned his head toward the center cross, his eyes burning with contempt. He did not see an innocent man. He saw a failure. If this man claimed to be powerful, why were they all dying? The criminal gathered his breath and shouted across the gap, his voice dripping with venom. "Aren't you supposed to be the Christ?" he yelled, his voice cracking with pain and rage. "If you are the Messiah, then prove it. Save yourself and save us too." The soldiers standing guard laughed at the outburst, amused that even a dying thief would mock the King of the Jews. The criminal continued to hurl insults, demanding a miracle, demanding an escape from the consequences of his own life. He wanted a savior who would take him down from the cross, not one who would die beside him. But the reaction from the other side was different. The criminal hanging on the right side of Jesus had been listening. He watched the man in the center. He saw the blood, the crown of thorns, and the quiet dignity that remained unbroken despite the mockery. He looked at the first criminal, and a sudden, fierce anger rose within him, not at the Romans, but at the injustice of his partner's words. With a supreme effort, the second criminal twisted his head to look past Jesus at the man on the left. His voice was weak, strained by the suffocation of the cross, but it carried the weight of a final truth. "Do you not even fear God?" he rebuked the first man, his voice raspy but firm. "We are dying. We are under the same sentence of death as he is." He paused, gasping for air, his chest heaving. Longinus stepped closer, intrigued by the change in the man's tone. The criminal continued, his words cutting through the jeers of the crowd. "We are getting exactly what we deserve. We committed the crimes. We are paying the price for our deeds. But this man," he nodded painfully toward Jesus, "he has done nothing wrong." A silence seemed to settle over the immediate area near the crosses. The admission of guilt was rare in the face of death. Usually, men died claiming innocence. But this thief had seen something in Jesus that stripped away his defenses. He stopped looking at the other criminal and turned his gaze fully upon Jesus. In that wreck of a human body next to him, he did not see a victim. He saw a king. He saw a ruler of a kingdom that was not made of wood and nails. The thief lowered his voice, speaking directly to Jesus with a desperate, naked hope. "Jesus," he whispered, the name leaving his lips like a prayer, "remember me when you come into your kingdom." Longinus, standing just a few feet away, felt a shock run through his system. It was absurd. A dying criminal asking a dying carpenter for a place in a kingdom. By all Roman logic, this was madness. Jesus had no army, no territory, and no crown but the one made of thorns. He was losing his life, yet this thief was asking him for salvation. Longinus waited for Jesus to ignore him, or perhaps to tell him it was too late. But Jesus, fighting through the haze of pain, turned his head. He looked at the thief, not with judgment, but with an intensity of love that startled the centurion. Jesus did not promise that he would take them down from the cross. He did not promise to kill their enemies. He offered something far more impossible. "Truly, I tell you," Jesus said, his voice steady and sovereign, "today you will be with me in paradise." The words hung in the air. Paradise. It was a promise of immediate, absolute rescue, not for the body, but for the soul. Longinus stared at Jesus. He had just heard a man, stripped of everything, disposing of a heavenly kingdom as if it were his to give. The thief on the right slumped back against the wood, but the terror was gone from his eyes. He had received an assurance that no Roman decree could revoke. Longinus gripped his spear tighter. He had watched men die for decades. He knew the look of despair, but he had never seen a man die like this thief, comforted by a promise from a fellow sufferer. And he had certainly never seen a condemned man speak with the authority of a god while bleeding to death. The centurion felt the ground beneath his beliefs shifting. He was the executioner, the agent of the most powerful empire on earth. Yet, in the presence of this conversation, he felt incredibly small. The authority on that hill did not belong to Pilate, nor to Caesar. It belonged to the dying man in the center. As the day progressed toward the 6th hour, the natural order of the world suddenly began to unravel. The sun, which had been beating down with the relentless heat of the Judean afternoon, began to fail. It was not the gradual dimming of a setting sun, nor was it the passing of a simple storm cloud. The light simply drained from the sky, as if the heavens themselves were closing their eyes to the events on the hill. A veil of darkness, thick and unnatural, descended upon the land, turning noon into midnight. Longinus stood in the growing gloom, his instincts as a soldier flaring with alarm. He looked up, but there was no eclipse, no sandstorm that could explain this total absence of light. The darkness was heavy, suffocating. The crowd, which had been so loud and aggressive only moments before, fell into a terrified silence. The mockery died in their throats. Men who had been shouting insults now looked around in confusion, clutching their cloaks tighter, fear replacing their arrogance. The soldiers under Longinus's command stopped their gambling. They looked to their centurion for an explanation, for an order, for anything that made sense. But Longinus had no answers for them. He kept his hand on his sword, not to fight an enemy, but to steady his own trembling hand. In the midst of this terrifying shadow, Jesus, who had been hanging in silence for some time, gathered his strength to speak again. Longinus turned his ear toward the cross, expecting a cry of despair brought on by the darkness. He expected the prisoner to finally break, to curse the world that had rejected him. Instead, a voice raspy with pain but clear in its intent cut through the blackness. Jesus lifted his head slightly, not looking at the crowd, but looking upward into the void. "Father," Jesus said, his voice struggling against the suffocation of his own lungs, "forgive them, for they do not know what they are doing." The words hit Longinus like a physical blow to the chest. He froze, his boots rooted to the rocky ground. He replayed the sentence in his mind, trying to make sense of it. Forgive them. Who was he speaking of? Longinus looked at the soldiers near the foot of the cross, the men who had driven the nails, the men who had cast lots for the tunic, the men who had laughed while the blood flowed. Jesus was praying for them. Then, the realization struck Longinus with the force of a hammer. He was the one in charge. He was the one who had given the orders. He was the instrument of this execution. Jesus was praying for him. A shiver ran through the centurion's body, cold and sharp. He had overseen the deaths of many men, and in their final moments, they had offered him hatred, vengeance, and curses. They had spat at him with their dying breath. But this man, this king of the Jews, was using his last reserves of energy to plead for the very people killing him. He was asking his God to show mercy to his executioners. Longinus looked at Jesus, really looked at him, through the gloom. He saw a man who was being tortured to death, yet whose primary concern was the spiritual fate of his torturers. They do not know what they are doing. The excuse was an act of supreme grace. Longinus felt a crack form in the armor of his heart, a barrier he had built over decades of military service. He felt exposed, judged not by anger, but by a kindness so alien to his world that it was terrifying. The darkness deepened, lasting hour after hour, a long, suspended nightmare. The air grew cold. The religious leaders, who had been so confident in the sunlight, now huddled together, whispering frantically, their confidence shaken by the sky's refusal to give light. They looked at the cross with growing unease. Longinus remained at his post, motionless. He could not look away from the man who had forgiven him before he had even asked. The centurion realized that while he held the spear and the authority of Rome, he was powerless. The man on the cross, pinned and dying, held a power that Longinus could not comprehend, the power to absolve the unforgivable. As the darkness stretched toward the 9th hour, Longinus waited in the silence, feeling that the world he knew was ending, and something entirely new was waiting to be born in the dark. The darkness that had swallowed the land held firm until the 9th hour. It was a heavy, supernatural silence that seemed to press against the eardrums of every living soul on the hill. Longinus stood in the gloom, his hand resting on the hilt of his sword, not out of aggression, but out of a desperate need to hold on to something solid in a world that had suddenly become fluid and terrifying. The air was still, devoid of even the slightest breeze, as if nature itself was holding its breath, waiting for the final beat of the heart hanging on the center cross. Jesus' body began to falter. The physical struggle to lift himself for air became agonizingly slow. Each breath was a battle against the nails and the exhaustion. Suddenly, a cry erupted from his throat that shattered the oppressive silence. It was not a moan of physical pain, but a scream of spiritual desolation that chilled the blood of everyone present. My God, why have you forsaken me?" The voice was loud, startlingly powerful for a man so near death. It echoed off the rocks of Golgotha and seemed to pierce the very darkness above. Longinus flinched. He had heard men scream for their mothers, for water, for mercy, but he had never heard a man call out to God with such raw, abandoned grief. It sounded as if the connection between the Son and the Father, a bond that Longinus had sensed earlier, had been violently severed. Some of the bystanders, confused by the Aramaic words and the distortion of his voice, misunderstood him. "Listen," one man whispered fearfully to another. "He is calling for Elijah." They believed he was pleading for the great prophet of old to come down from the heavens and rescue him from the Romans. A ripple of nervous energy moved through the crowd. They looked at the sky, half expecting fire and chariots to descend. One man, moved by a sudden impulse, perhaps pity, perhaps a desire to prolong the moment, ran to a vessel full of sour wine that stood nearby. He took a sponge, soaked it in the vinegar, and put it on the end of a long reed. He ran up to the cross and pressed the sponge against Jesus' dry, cracked lips. "Wait," the others shouted. "Let us see if Elijah comes to save him." But Jesus did not drink deeply. He turned his face away, refusing the comfort. The time for relief had passed. The time for completion had arrived. He needed his mind clear for the final act. A solemn, heavy silence fell upon the scene once more. Jesus lifted his gaze. He was no longer looking at the crowd, or the soldiers, or even his mother. He was looking past the darkness, past the pain, into a reality that only he could see. He gathered every last ounce of strength remaining in his broken body. He pushed up against the nails one last time, expanding his chest. "It is finished," he cried out. It was not a whisper of defeat. It was a declaration of victory. It was the sound of a debt being paid in full. Longinus felt the authority in those words vibrate through the ground. Then, for the last time, Jesus raised his eyes to the sky and spoke with a voice of final trust. "Father, into your hands I commit my spirit." With those words, the tension left his body. His head bowed forward, chin resting on his chest, and he breathed his last. The struggle was over, the execution was complete. But the earth was not finished. Suddenly, the ground beneath everyone's feet gave a violent lurch. A low rumble, sounding like the growl of a great beast, rose from the depths of the earth. The rumble exploded into a violent earthquake that shook the hill of Golgotha to its very foundations. The soldiers lost their footing, stumbling and grabbing onto each other for support. The crowd screamed in absolute terror, falling to their knees, covering their heads as the world around them convulsed. Rocks near the execution site split apart with the sound of cracking thunder. Great boulders tumbled down the slopes. The vibration was so intense that it felt as though the hill itself was trying to throw off the weight of the cross. At that exact moment, miles away in the city, inside the great temple of Jerusalem, a different kind of violence occurred. The massive, heavy veil that separated the holy place from the most holy place, the barrier that signified the separation between God and man, was seized by an invisible hand. It tore in two, from the very top to the very bottom, ripping apart the old order of the world. Back on the hill, the chaos was absolute. Faces that had once mocked the prisoner were now twisted in pure horror. Men beat their chests in regret, realizing too late that they had made a mistake of cosmic proportions. The darkness, the cry, the death, and now the earth revolting against them, it was too much to be a coincidence. In the center of the shaking earth, Longinus dropped to his knees. His helmet fell from his head, clattering onto the vibrating stones. He looked up at the lifeless body of Jesus, which swayed rhythmically with the tremors of the earthquake. The centurion's heart hammered against his ribs, breaking through the walls of his discipline. The realization hit him with the force of the earthquake itself. This was no criminal. This was no ordinary man. The signs were undeniable. Words escaped from his lips before he could stop them, a confession torn from the depth of his soul. With a trembling voice, loud enough to be heard over the rumbling earth, he declared openly, "Truly, this man was the Son of God." The centurion, who had overseen the crucifixion, became the first Gentile to publicly acknowledge the crucified Christ. He stayed on his knees as the aftershocks continued, oblivious to the panic around him, his eyes locked on the man he had killed, realizing that the blood on his hands was the blood of the divine. The executioner had become the witness. The violent tremors of the earth finally subsided, leaving behind a silence that was even more terrifying than the noise. The dust that had been shaken loose from the rocks hung in the stagnant air, creating a ghostly haze around the three crosses. The crowd, which had stood so defiantly only hours before, began to disintegrate. Fear had replaced their bloodlust. People hurried away from the hill, casting nervous glances over their shoulders, beating their chests in acts of sudden contrition. They wanted to be as far away from this place as possible before the sky decided to judge them again. Longinus remained at his post. He retrieved his helmet from the ground, dusting off the grit, and placed it back on his head. The action was mechanical, a habit of a lifetime of service. But the man inside the armor had changed. He looked up at the center cross. The body of Jesus hung motionless, a stark contrast to the two men on either side who were still fighting their losing battle for air. The centurion felt a heavy weight in his chest, a burden of truth that he did not yet know how to carry. He had executed a god, or at least a son of the gods, and the realization left him feeling hollow and exposed. However, the day was not yet over, and the demands of the world pressed in. It was the day of preparation, the Friday before the Sabbath. For the Jewish leaders, the setting sun marked the beginning of a holy time, a high Sabbath of the Passover week. Their religious laws were strict. No bodies could remain hanging on a cross after sunset, for it would defile the land. The very men who had conspired to murder an innocent man were now obsessed with the purity of their ritual calendar. A delegation of priests, anxious and hurried, had sent word to Pontius Pilate. They did not care about the earthquake or the darkness. They cared about the rules. Their request was specific and brutal. They asked the governor to order the legs of the condemned men to be broken. This practice, known to the Romans as crurifragium, was a mercy disguised as cruelty. By shattering the shin bones, the soldiers would prevent the victims from pushing themselves up to breathe. Without the ability to support their weight, the diaphragm would collapse, and death by asphyxiation would follow within minutes. It was a way to speed up the slow agony of the cross so the bodies could be buried before the first star appeared. The order came down from the governor's palace swiftly. A messenger arrived at Golgotha, breathless, handing the scroll to Longinus. The centurion read the command. It was standard procedure, yet today it felt like a desecration. He looked at his soldiers, who were sitting uneasily on some rocks, shaken by the earthquake. "Get up," Longinus commanded, his voice rough. "We have orders from the governor. Break their legs and take them down. The sun is setting." The soldiers, eager to leave this cursed hill, moved quickly. They picked up a heavy iron bar, a tool designed for this specific grim purpose. They approached the criminal on the left first. The man was still conscious, his eyes wide with panic as he saw the weapon. He tried to pull his legs up, to shrink away from the inevitable, but he was pinned by iron nails. The soldier swung the heavy bar with practiced force. The sound of bone shattering cracked through the quiet air. The criminal let out a final, strangled cry before his body slumped heavily. his chest unable to expand. The fight went out of him, and the silence of death began to take hold. Longinus watched, his face impassive, but his stomach churned. He walked behind the soldiers as they moved to the other side. The second criminal, the one who had spoken of paradise, looked at the soldiers with resignation, as he did not struggle. He seemed to be holding on to the promise he had received earlier, a lifeline that extended beyond the pain. The iron bar swung again. The blow was decisive. The thief's legs collapsed, and his breathing became shallow gasps that grew fainter with every passing second. Then the soldiers turned toward the center cross. They gripped the iron bar tightly, preparing to strike the legs of Jesus. Longinus stepped forward, his hand raising instinctively. He moved closer to the body of the Nazarene. The head of Jesus was bowed low, his chin resting on his chest. His body was utterly still. There was no rising and falling of the rib cage, no twitching of the muscles in the legs. "Wait," Longinus said, his voice halting the soldier who was winding up for the strike. The soldiers paused, looking at their commander in confusion. "Sir," one of them asked, "the orders are to break them all." Longinus ignored him. He walked right up to the timber, looking up into the face of the man who had changed the world in 6 hours. He had seen enough death to know its signature. The grayness of the skin, the relaxation of the facial muscles, the absolute absence of spirit. Jesus was already dead. There was no need for the iron bar. There was no need to inflict further violence on a vessel that was already empty. "He is already dead," Longinus declared. "Do not break his legs." The soldiers lowered the heavy bar, relieved to be spared the effort. Longinus breathed out, a sigh that was almost a prayer. He remembered the old Jewish scriptures he had heard whispered in the marketplaces, prophecies about a righteous sufferer, not one of his bones will be broken. Unknowingly, by halting the iron bar, Longinus was fulfilling a prophecy written centuries before he was born. He stood guard over the body, the protector of the corpse, ensuring that the brutality of Rome stopped here, but the law required proof. He could not just say the prisoner was dead, he had to prove it. And so, the centurion reached for the spear, leaning against a rock, preparing for the final act of verification. The order to spare the legs of the Nazarene had been given, but the requirements of Roman law remained absolute. Death had to be certain. There could be no mistake, no coma mistaken for the end, no possibility of a later revival. If a condemned man were taken down alive, the life of the centurion would be forfeited in exchange. Longinus knew this. He was a man of the empire, and he did not leave tasks unfinished. He turned to the soldier standing nearest to the cross and took the heavy spear from his hand. The weapon was familiar to him, an extension of his own arm, used in countless battles to defend the borders of Rome. Yet, as he weighed it in his hand now, it felt different. It felt like a key that was about to unlock a door he was afraid to open. Longinus stepped closer to the central cross. He looked up at the silent, pale form of Jesus. The chest was still, the head hung heavy. To the naked eye, life had fled, but Longinus needed to prove it to the governor, to the priests, and perhaps to himself. He tightened his grip on the wooden shaft of the spear. He took a breath, steadied his stance, and with a swift, practiced motion, he thrust the spear upward. The iron tip pierced the right side of Jesus' body, sliding between the ribs with a sickening ease, pushing deep toward the heart. It was a blow that would have killed any living man instantly. Longinus pulled the weapon back, expecting only the dark, sluggish flow of post-mortem blood. But what happened next defied all his experience on the battlefield. From the wound, a sudden, distinct flow burst forth. It was not just blood. It was a stream of blood and water, flowing separately yet together. The water was clear, crystalline, mixing with the crimson red in a stream that cascaded down the side of the pale body. Longinus stood directly beneath the wound, looking up, transfixed by the sight. He did not step back. A spray of this sacred mixture fell from the height of the cross. It splashed onto his upturned face. It ran down his cheeks, and, as tradition would later recount, it fell directly into his eyes. For years, Longinus had suffered from an ailment that clouded his vision, a growing darkness that blurred the edges of the world. It was a soldier's fear to lose his sight, to become useless to the legion. He had lived with the constant strain of squinting, of hiding his weakness. But the moment the blood and water from the side of Jesus touched his eyes, a shock wave of sensation rushed through his head. It was not pain, it was the opposite of pain. It was a sudden, sharp clarity. He blinked, and the gray fog that had plagued him for so long vanished. The world snapped into brilliant, high-definition focus. He could see the grain in the wood of the cross. He could see the texture of the skin on the dead man. He could see the individual hairs on his own arm. His physical blindness was washed away in an instant, healed by the very blood he had just spilled. But the physical healing was only a shadow of the internal earthquake occurring within his soul. Longinus dropped the spear. It clattered against the stones, the tip stained red. He brought his hands to his face, touching his eyes, gasping for air. The prophecy he had heard whispered in the streets of Jerusalem crashed into his mind with the force of a storm. They will look upon him whom they have pierced. He was the one. He was the fulfillment of the ancient words. He had not just executed a rebel, he had pierced the body of the divine. The evangelist John, standing nearby, watched this happen with wide eyes, silently recording the moment in his memory so that he could later write, "He who saw it has borne witness, and his testimony is true." Longinus fell to his knees for the second time that day. This was not the knee of a soldier buckling under the earth shaking. This was the knee of a sinner bending before his Savior. The water represented purification. The blood represented redemption, and both had covered him. The other soldiers stepped back, unnerved by their commander's behavior. They saw a man who was known for his iron discipline now kneeling in the dirt, weeping, his face stained with the blood of the prisoner, his eyes wide with a terrifying wonder. "It is true," Longinus whispered, his voice trembling with a mixture of grief and joy. "He is the Son of God." The realization broke him and remade him in the same second. The centurion who had marched up the hill was dead. The man who knelt at the foot of the cross was something entirely new. He looked at his hands, expecting to feel guilt, but instead, he felt a strange, overwhelming peace. He had completed the sacrifice. He had drawn the blood that would wash the world clean. The sun began to set, casting long shadows over Golgotha, but for Longinus, the light had finally come. He remained there as the soldiers began the work of lowering the bodies, no longer issuing orders, but watching with the reverence of a disciple. He had come to the hill as an enemy of the cross, but he would leave it as its first convert. Longinus returned to the Antonia fortress, but the man who walked through the heavy wooden gates was not the same commander who had marched out at dawn. The camp was alive with the usual noise of evening duties. Soldiers sharpened their blades, shouted crude jokes across the fire, and gambled for copper coins. It was the rhythm of the Roman machine, a rhythm that had been the heartbeat of Longinus's life for decades. But now, as he walked through the courtyard, the sounds felt distant, foreign, and jarring. He entered his private quarters and removed his helmet, placing it on the table with a heavy thud. He began to unbuckle his armor, piece by piece. The leather straps felt suffocating. He removed the breastplate that had protected him in countless battles, but he felt more vulnerable now than he ever had on a battlefield. He looked at his hands. They were clean of blood, washed at the cistern outside, yet he could still feel the warmth of the sacred flow that had touched him. He rubbed his eyes that now saw with a terrifying, crystal clarity, and tried to push away the image of the man on the cross. But the image would not leave. For the next 2 days, sleep refused to come. Longinus lay on his cot, staring at the rough ceiling. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the moment the spear pierced the side. He heard the cry of "It is finished" echoing in the silence of the room. The silence of the Nazarene haunted him more than the screams of all the men he had killed in war. He questioned his sanity. He questioned his loyalty. He was a centurion of Rome, sworn to the emperor, yet his heart was bowing to a dead Jewish carpenter. He could no longer follow orders without wondering if he were serving the truth or merely a blind, brutal empire. When he barked commands at his subordinates, his voice lacked its usual edge of iron. The men noticed. They whispered behind his back, wondering why their fierce leader had gone quiet, why he spent hours staring at the wall, why he refused to join in their meals. Then the rumors began. It started as a ripple of panic on the morning of the first day of the week. Longinus was inspecting the guard rotation when a group of soldiers burst into the fortress, breathless and pale with terror. These were the men who had been assigned to guard the tomb of Jesus. The chief priests had requested a Roman guard to seal the stone, fearing that the disciples might steal the body. Longinus knew these men. They were veterans, not easily frightened. But now, they looked like children who had seen a ghost. Longinus pulled the ranking guard aside, gripping his arm tightly. "Report," he commanded, his voice low and urgent. "Why have you abandoned your post? If the body is stolen, it is your heads." The soldier shook his head violently, his eyes wide with a lingering shock. "We did not sleep, sir. We were awake. But then—" The earth shook again, just like on Friday. The soldier swallowed hard, his throat dry, and there was a light. It was not the sun. It was like lightning, but it stood still. The stone, the great stone, was rolled away as if it were a pebble. Longinus felt a cold shiver race down his spine. "And the body?" he asked. "Gone," the soldier whispered. "The tomb is empty. He is not there." Longinus released the man's arm. He stepped back, his mind reeling. An empty tomb, a stone moved by no human hand. The words Jesus had spoken, words that had been mocked by the priests, suddenly rushed back to him. "Destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up." Later that day, the official story changed. Longinus watched from the shadows as the chief priests met with the terrified guards. He saw the heavy bags of gold changing hands. He heard the instructions given by the religious leaders. "You are to say that his disciples came during the night and stole him away while we were asleep." Longinus clenched his fists. It was a lie, a clumsy, desperate lie. Roman soldiers did not sleep on guard duty. The penalty for sleeping was death. If they had truly been asleep, they would be executed, not paid. The bribery confirmed everything Longinus had suspected. The body had not been stolen. The power he had felt at the cross had not ended with death. The centurion retreated to the solitude of the city walls. He looked out over Jerusalem, a city that was trying to return to normal, trying to pretend that God had not just died and risen within its gates. But Longinus could not return to normal. The resurrection was not a rumor to him. It was the logical conclusion of what he had witnessed. If the man could forgive his killers while dying, if he could command the sun to darken, then death could not hold him. He realized then that his career, his rank, and his past were nothing but dust. He could not serve a lie any longer. The fire that had been ignited by the spear thrust was now a consuming blaze. He knew he had to find the followers of this man. He had to know more. He had to understand how a death could bring life. The ruthless centurion was gone, replaced by a man desperate for the truth, standing on the edge of a decision that would cost him his life, but save his soul. The empire had its gold and its swords, but the empty tomb had the final word. The decision had been made in the silence of the night, but the execution of that decision required a courage far greater than charging into battle. Longinus stood in the center of the barracks, surrounded by the familiar smells of leather, oil, and iron. The morning trumpet had sounded, calling the legionnaires to assembly, but Longinus did not move to join them. Instead, he began to dismantle his life. He unbuckled the cingulum, the heavy military belt that signified his status and authority. He let it fall to the floor. Next, he removed his breastplate, the metal armor that bore the scratches and dents of service to the empire. Finally, he took his gladius, the short Roman sword that had been his constant companion for decades. He looked at the blade, cold and sharp, an instrument of death that had served the will of Caesar. He realized with a sudden, absolute clarity that he could never raise it against another human being again. The hands that had been washed by the blood of the innocent could no longer shed blood for the guilty. He marched not to the parade ground, but to the quarters of the tribune, the commander of the cohort. He did not wait to be announced. He pushed past the guards and entered the room. The tribune, busy with maps and reports, looked up in surprise at the intrusion, his eyes narrowing as he saw the centurion standing there without his armor, holding his sword by the blade, handle extended forward. "What is the meaning of this, Longinus?" the tribune demanded, his voice sharp with irritation. "The assembly has begun. Why are you not in uniform?" Longinus stepped forward and placed the sword on the wooden table. The metal clattered loudly against the wood, a sound of finality. "My service is finished," Longinus stated, his voice steady and calm. The tribune stared at the weapon, then up at Longinus, his face flushing with anger. "You are relieved when Rome says you are relieved. Pick up that sword, centurion. Do not play games with me. We have riots to contain and a province to govern. I can no longer serve Rome, Longinus replied, not shouting, but with a firmness that filled the room. I have found a new king. I cannot serve two masters. The tribune stood up slowly, his hand resting on his own weapon. The air in the room grew heavy with the threat of violence. Careful with your words, he hissed. To deny Caesar is treason. To desert your post is death. You know the law. If you walk out that door without my permission, you are no longer a centurion. You are a fugitive. You will be hunted. You will be killed. Longinus looked at the officer. A week ago, the threat of death would have kept him in line, but he had seen death conquered. He had seen a tomb emptied. The threats of the empire suddenly seemed hollow, like the shouting of children against a storm. I have seen the truth, Longinus said. Do what you must, but I will not carry the sword of an empire that murders gods. Without waiting for a dismissal, Longinus turned and walked out. The tribune shouted for the guards, but the sheer audacity of the act, the confusing nature of a decorated veteran simply walking away, stunned them into momentary inaction. Longinus slipped through the gates of the fortress, merging into the crowded streets of Jerusalem. He was no longer a hunter. He was now the prey. He did not flee the city immediately. He had one mission to complete before he vanished. He needed to find them. He moved through the back alleys, avoiding the patrols that would soon be looking for him. He asked questions in low tones, seeking out the whispers about the followers of the Nazarene. Eventually, his search led him to a modest house in the lower city, a place where the disciples were rumored to be gathering in fear and prayer. Longinus stood before the wooden door, his heart hammered against his ribs. He was the enemy. He was the face of the execution. To knock on this door was madness. They would likely kill him or flee in terror. But he had to tell them. He had to speak the words that were burning a hole in his chest. He knocked. 3 heavy strikes. Silence fell inside the house. Then, footsteps approached slowly. The door creaked open just a crack, and a fearful eye peered out. It was one of the followers. The man saw the Roman tunic, the military haircut, the bearing of a soldier. He tried to slam the door shut, shouting a warning to those inside. "Wait," Longinus cried out, jamming his foot in the doorframe. "I am not here to arrest you. I am unarmed." He pushed the door open, not with violence, but with desperation, and stumbled into the room. There were about a dozen men and women inside. They scrambled back, knocking over chairs, reaching for knives, their faces pale with panic. Peter stood at the front, shielding the others, his eyes wide with recognition. "You," Peter whispered, his voice trembling. "You are the centurion. You were there at the hill." Longinus dropped to his knees. The sight of a Roman officer kneeling on the dusty floor of a Jewish home stopped the panic instantly. It was an image that defied all social and political order. Longinus looked up at them, tears welling in his healed eyes. "I am the one," Longinus confessed, his voice breaking. "I commanded the guard. I oversaw the nails. I thrust the spear into his side." A gasp went through the room. Tension, sharp and dangerous, filled the air. But Longinus continued before they could act. "But when I pierced him," he said, pointing to his own eyes, I saw the blood and the water. I saw the earth shake. I heard him forgive us. I heard him forgive me." He looked directly at Peter. "He is the Son of God. I know it. I have left everything. I have left the army. I have left my life. I only want to know, can a man who killed his Savior be forgiven by him?" Silence stretched out in the room, heavy and profound. Peter looked at the kneeling man. He saw the genuine agony and the desperate hope in the soldier's face. He remembered the words of Jesus on the cross, "Father, forgive them." Peter stepped forward. He reached out a hand, rough and calloused from fishing, and placed it on the shoulder of the man who had executed his Lord. "Stand up, brother," Peter said softly. "If he forgave you on the cross, who are we to condemn you now?" Longinus stood. For the first time, he heard the story not from the perspective of a judge, but from the family. They told him of the teachings, the miracles, and the resurrection appearances. He drank in every word like a man dying of thirst. He learned that his name, Longinus, would no longer be written in the rolls of the Roman legion, but in a book of life that no emperor could burn. But he could not stay. Jerusalem was too dangerous for a deserter. The hunt for him would be ruthless. Peter and the others advised him to travel north to the rugged lands of Cappadocia and Caesarea, where the empire's grip was looser and the people were hungry for hope. Longinus accepted the mission. He was given a new set of clothes, simple robes to replace his military tunic. He embraced the men he had once viewed as subjects to be crushed. Under the cover of darkness, he slipped out of the city gates, leaving behind the only life he had ever known. He walked into the night, unarmed, without money, and without rank. Yet, as he looked up at the stars, the same stars that had shone over Golgotha, he felt a strength he had never possessed as a soldier. He was carrying a weapon far more powerful than a sword. He was carrying a testimony. The journey of the executioner had ended. The journey of the evangelist had begun. Time moved forward, indifferent to the lives of men, but for Longinus, time had become a vessel for a single mission. Years turned into decades. The black hair of the centurion turned gray, and the upright posture of the soldier bowed slightly under the weight of endless miles walked on dusty roads. He had traveled far from Jerusalem, settling in the rugged, wind-swept region of Cappadocia. He was no longer known as the fearsome officer of Rome. To the growing communities of believers meeting in caves and hidden homes, he was simply the witness. His preaching was unlike that of the other apostles. Peter spoke of the miracles he had seen. John spoke of the love he had felt. But Longinus spoke of the end. He stood before crowds in the market squares of Caesarea, his voice raspy but commanding, and he would hold up his hands. These hands, he would tell them, silence falling over the listeners. These hands drove the iron into his flesh. These eyes were blind until his blood opened them. I watched him die. I made sure he was dead. And yet, I tell you the truth, death could not hold him. His testimony was dangerous. It was one thing for a Jewish fisherman to claim their Messiah had risen. It was another thing entirely for a decorated Roman veteran to declare that Caesar was not the true Lord of the world. The empire could ignore a religious sect for a while, but it could not ignore a traitor from within its own ranks. The order for his arrest finally came from the governor of Cappadocia, a man named Octavius, who was ambitious and eager to prove his loyalty to Rome. He sent a detachment of soldiers to the village where Longinus was staying. They arrived at night, torches burning, swords drawn, expecting a fight. They expected the former centurion to organize a resistance, to train the peasants in the art of war. Instead, when they kicked down the door of his humble dwelling, they found Longinus sitting at a wooden table, waiting for them. He did not reach for a weapon. He stood up, smoothed his tunic, and looked at the young officer leading the raid. "I have been expecting you," Longinus said calmly. "There is no need for chains. I will walk with you." The young officer, unnerved by this lack of fear, bound his hands anyway. They marched him back to the provincial capital, parading him through the streets as a warning to others. Longinus walked with his head held high, not in pride, but in the quiet confidence of a man who had already faced his own judgment at the foot of the cross and survived. The trial was held the next morning in the public square. Octavius sat on the judgment seat, flanked by standards of the Roman eagle. He looked down at Longinus with a mixture of contempt and confusion. "Longinus," Octavius began, his voice booming for the crowd to hear, "you are a citizen of Rome. You are a veteran of the legions. You have eaten the bread of the empire and taken its coin. Yet you stand here accused of spreading lies, of worshiping a dead criminal, and of inciting unrest. What do you say for yourself?" Longinus looked at the governor. "I speak no lies, Octavius. I speak only of what I saw. The man you call a criminal was the Son of God. I killed him, yet he lives. And because he lives, I have found a peace that Rome could never give me." "Peace?" Octavius laughed, a harsh, dry sound. "Rome gives you peace through order. This Jesus gives you nothing but a death sentence. Renounce him. Offer a pinch of incense to the image of the emperor, and you will be free. You can return to your pension. You can live out your days in comfort. Refuse, and you will die the death of a traitor." It was the same choice Pilate had given the crowd: Barabbas or Jesus, the world or the truth. Longinus did not hesitate. He thought of the moment the spear touched the side of the Lord. He thought of the water and the blood. "I cannot deny him," Longinus replied, his voice ringing clear across the square. I served Caesar with my sword, but I serve Christ with my soul. My body belongs to you to do with as you please, but my spirit belongs to him." Octavius's face turned red with fury. He signaled to the lictors, "Beat him. Let us see if his God protects his flesh." The punishment was brutal. They beat him with rods, breaking his teeth and tearing his skin. Yet, through the blood, Longinus continued to pray. He did not curse his tormentors. He did not beg for mercy. He simply endured, his eyes fixed on a point beyond the visible horizon. The crowd watched in horror and awe. They had seen many men die, but few died with such terrifying grace. Finally, realizing that pain would not break the old soldier, Octavius slammed his fist down. "Take him to the hill outside the city. Behead him. Let his name be forgotten." The soldiers dragged Longinus to the place of execution. It was a lonely, grassy mound, not unlike Golgotha. Longinus fell to his knees. The executioner, a large man with a heavy broadsword, approached him. The executioner hesitated, seeing the strange light in the prisoner's eyes. "Do your duty," Longinus whispered to him, smiling through his wounds. "You are sending me home." Longinus looked up at the sky. The clouds were drifting lazily, white against the blue. He took a deep breath, the air of the mortal world filling his lungs one last time. He remembered the last words of his master. "Father," Longinus said, his voice soft but unbroken, "into your hands I commit my spirit." The sword fell. The head of the centurion rolled onto the grass. The crowd fell silent. The soldiers, usually loud and boastful after a kill, sheathed their weapons quietly and walked away, unable to shake the feeling that they had just extinguished a holy fire. Longinus was dead, but the governor was wrong. His name would not be forgotten. The local Christians came under the cover of night, took his body, and buried him with honor. Stories of his courage spread like wildfire. He became known not as the executioner, but as Saint Longinus, the martyr who had seen the blood of God. However, the death of Longinus was not the end of the story. It was merely one chapter in a much larger revolution. He was but one man. Across the empire, the fire he had carried was spreading through the hearts of others. You must learn about the others who carried this torch. There was Peter, the fisherman who became the rock, preaching in Rome until they crucified him upside down. There was John, the beloved, who survived boiling oil and exile to write the final visions of the apocalypse. There was James, the first to die by the sword in Jerusalem. There was Andrew, Philip, Thomas, Bartholomew, Matthew, the tax collector, Simon the zealot, Thaddeus, and James the son of Alphaeus. From the dusty streets of Jerusalem to the far corners of the known earth, these 12 men carried a message powerful enough to challenge kings, tear down temples, and split history itself in two. They had no army, they had no swords, they had no political alliances. All they had was the absolute certainty of what they had seen and their own testimony. They walked into the darkest strongholds of paganism and lit a candle that the wind of persecution could not blow out. This is not just the story of a church or a religion. It is the story of how 12 ordinary men, and those like Longinus who joined them, stood up against the most powerful empire in human history and conquered the entire world using only their faith and the sacrifices they made along the way. The spear of Longinus had pierced the side of Christ, but the message of the cross had pierced the heart of the world, and the wound would never heal. It would only bleed love forever.